Hi everyone, this is Clint from Persuasive Evangelism, and today we're going to go over this book, Why I Trust the Bible by William D. Mounce. I discovered him recently. He was interviewed by Sean McDowell on his YouTube channel, and I thought it was really interesting. And he mentioned this book, and this is a great resource about everything about the Bible. Um, William is a PhD from Aberdeen University, and he's the founder and president of BibleTraining.org. He's also worked on he was the New Testament chair of the English Standard Version's Translation Oversight Committee. The ESV, the English Standard Version, is the one that I currently read. I really like that translation. He currently serves on the New International Versions Committee for Bible Translations. So that's the NIV. And the NIV is the one I read growing up. So ESV and NIV are probably the two most popular translations. So he's worked on both of those committees. So I thought that was interesting. But this is all about the Bible, how there's chapters on translations, how they translate, and how the theories of translation, how people try to do more word for word or thought to thought. That was really fascinating. There's a chapter on how the canon of the Bible came together. There's references to Jesus outside of the New Testament documents that I found interesting, such as Pliny the Younger, or at least Christianity as well. Suetonius, Tacitus, and this one I think I had heard this once a long time ago, but I forgot. His name's Thallus. Thallus was a first century historian who wrote about the darkness that occurred during the time of the crucifixion. So when Jesus died, a darkness fell across the land, and then someone outside of the Bible mentions that darkness falling. So I thought I'm gonna have to look into that. And then he has a little section of basically all of these documents outside of the Bible, these early documents, what we can learn about Jesus from those early documents. So I'm just going to read that off. So Jesus lived. He was Jewish. He lived in the first third of the first century. People believed he had been born out of wedlock, which gives hints to the virgin birth. Jesus' ministries overlapped with John the Baptist. Jesus worked wondrous feats. He gathered disciples. Jesus lived in conflict with the Jewish authorities. Jesus was described as a sorcerer who led Israel astray. Some believed him to be the Messiah. Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And then one Talmudic tradition says he was hung, but some early writings use hung for suspension on a pole. Jesus was believed to have been seen raised from the dead by his followers, who now worshiped him as God. And then his brother James was martyred in AD 62 by the high priest Ananias. So kind of little highlights of Jesus' life outside of the Bible. It talks about, there's chapters about who wrote the Gospels, information about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It talks about difficult passages in the Bible where people say, oh, this could be a contradiction or apparent contradiction. And then he goes over and explains how to interpret those. Sometimes, different gospels might mention the same event and then describe different things that happen. And J. Warner Wallace talks about that gave him, he's a cold case detective. He was an atheist, and he talked about how when he took people's different witnesses to crimes and so on, they might be in the same room and explain different things from what they noticed, just from their different perspectives or what, they're focused on. So it's interesting. It goes over some of those. It talks about, as I mentioned, the canon and how those books came together, and the history, the references of early church leaders mentioning the books of the Bible that eventually what we call the New Testament. And also it talks about so all the manuscripts we have so many manuscripts of the Bible compared to anything, and they're so close to when they were written. I think the earliest manuscript. It's just a little, I think, one page, or the papyrus, or one little section of John, the Gospel of John, which could date to the end of the 1st century or early the 2nd century, which means it's only a few decades at the most, from the when John was originally written, which some say in the 70s or 80s AD. So just a few years after that, might have been one of the first copies of John. So that close to the original copies. I guess in 300, around 300 AD, one of the Roman emperors, basically banned Christianity and wanted to burn all the documents. So they lost a lot of manuscripts then, but even with that, Christianity has spread so far that we have a lot of manuscripts before 300 AD. So with all these massive amount of manuscripts, they'll check them all and see if there's any variants. Most of the variants, could be misspellings, or maybe they say the name different, or maybe there's an extra word in there. So he talks about the variants. And I'm just going to briefly mention it. So this says we have more than 5,600 manuscripts of Greek New Testament, but none of the, the autographs, which is the actual first document written. Among the 400,000 textual variants, 99% make virtually no difference whatsoever. They are either not meaningful or not viable. The fewer than 1% of the variants that are meaningful and viable do not affect or call into question a single biblical doctrine, cardinal or otherwise. And then it says, textual critics look at the external and internal evidence and have done excellent work in combining through all the manuscripts and making their decisions, and there is not a single viable variant that calls into question any point of biblical theology, major or minor. And then it talks about how they weight the manuscripts. And then it gives a history of all the manuscripts we have, which I thought was fascinating. So I'm just going to briefly mention this. So I need to explain something called text types. The library in Alexandria, Egypt, was one of the great wonders of the ancient world. One of the characteristics of the manuscripts copied there were that they were faithfully and carefully copied. We don't find nearly as many errors, intentional or unintentional, as we find in manuscripts from other areas of the world. So the Alexandria text types, so there's a group of manuscripts that we have called the Alexandria text types. We find these manuscripts of this text type until the 10th century. And then he mentions two outstanding manuscripts, early manuscripts from that type, the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus. And then it says another group of manuscripts we call the Western text type. Some scholars call these missionary texts. Think of Wycliffe translators working in Africa, learning a language, creating an alphabet, and then translating the Bible into the language. What kind of Bible will they create? Because they are missionaries, they will create a Bible that is above all understandable, which means they will include interpretive information in the translation in itself. So it says, as the church expanded westward, the manuscripts needed to be understandable. That's why we find so many expansions and simplifications in these manuscripts. And it says, as a result, manuscripts from the Western type text tend not to be as reliable as the Alexandrian, even though they're very old, dating back to early centuries. The church in the West turned to Latin, and today we have about 10,000 Latin manuscripts of the New Testament. The Latin Vulgate was dominant Bible of the church for almost a millennium, and it was based on the Western text type. As the use of Greek language dropped off, so did the number of Greek manuscripts of this text type, but they did continue to be used and copied until the 9th century. And then there's another text type called the Byzantine text type. Starting in the late 4th century, it appears that a new text type was formed called the Byzantine text type. These manuscripts were traditionally associated with Byzantium, the new name for Constantinople. That's basically the Eastern Empire. When the Western Empire fell, Rome fell, the Eastern survived, and their capital was Constantinople for another 1,000 years. And that's where those text types come from. And they call it now the Byzantine Empire, but it was actually the Roman Empire in the East that survived. So when the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in AD 313, he had 50 Bibles copied. These were probably of the Byzantine text type. The Byzantine texts are more uniform than the Western and even the Alexandria manuscripts, probably because they originated from a relatively small geographical area and would have been controlled by liturgical usage in the church. When Byzantium fell, the Eastern Roman Empire fell to the Ottomans in 1453. The Greek scribes fled to Europe with the precious manuscripts, and during the Renaissance, with its emphasis on Greek and Hebrew, these text types flourished. These Byzantine manuscripts became known as the majority texts, MT, because there were so many of them. And so then the Greek texts published on the Gutenberg's printing press and manuscripts based on Aramis' work became known as the Textus Receptus, TR, received text. It was this version of the TR that the King James Version translators used to make the King James Version. For centuries, the Byzantine type was all we had. There were thousands of differences among these manuscripts, but in broad strokes, they agree with one another. And then in the mid to late 19th century, archaeologists started finding more manuscripts that were older than and different from the Byzantine manuscripts. These finds include the Alexandria manuscripts. And the science of textual criticism was developed at that point. Well, this is a simplified description of the historical process. It should be enough to help you understand the following discussions. So interesting how all these manuscripts came, and now there's textual criticism, and then he goes into digging deeper into textual criticism. Let's see what else he has. And then the chapters on translations were interesting. He gives examples of, like, maybe a phrase and how the different ways it can be translated, and then and how different Bible translations, they have different kind of, as I mentioned, trying to make it more there. He said there's no literal, like, word for word, because it's a different language, and some words maybe in the Greek there's not a word for it in English, exact word, so you have to kind of decide what works best. And it talks about translation philosophy, and then all the different ways, like formal equivalence, functional, dynamic equivalence, natural language, and then it talks about all the different translations. And then the last few chapters is the character of God, and then it goes into some about the Old Testament as well. Human sin, nature of evil, God's view, the flood, and then he goes, reading all this, diving deep into all the manuscript and so on. It's made him even a stronger Christian. It's just helped his faith even more. But this is a really great resource about the whole history of the Bible and how they translate, and how the canon was established, who wrote the books of the Bible, and difficult passages to how to analyze that and so on. But I totally recommend this book. It's easy to read too. So it's by William D. Mounce, and it's called Why I Trust the Bible. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye. God bless.